So I had a first this week. I actually disagreed with a Joe Heshmeyer video. The name of his video is Pope Leo a Liberal. And this topic is important enough that I wanted to actually make a response video to it. Now, Joe Heshmeyer has been hugely influential in my life. I converted to a Catholicism a year ago this November. And when I was going through that process of coming from Anglicanism to Catholicism, whenever I would have a doctrinal issue that I couldn't work out, so like something like the Marian dogmas or something, I would watch his videos, and at the start I'd be like, there's no way he'll be able to explain this. And invariably by the end of the video, I was convinced that he and the Catholics are right. So again, just a hugely influential person in my life, and I have tremendous respect for him. But I do think this video was particularly bad. And so I wanted to maybe present a better way. Now I understand my channel is completely insignificant, but I have studied liberalism for the past 10 years or so. So this is a topic I do know something about, and I think I can speak to well. I consider liberalism the primary enemy of the church, at least in the West. I'm not going to go into what liberalism is. Definitely recommend this book by Cardinal, I don't speak French, so Billiot or something like that. But liberalism is basically the exaltation of man and human freedom over against God. So basically putting man in God's place. And the thing about this stark difference, it's black and white. We're not talking about shades of gray here. And so we're asking, when we ask the question, is the Pope a liberal? It should be pretty obvious, actually, because again, we're talking about diametrically opposed worldviews, faiths, so to speak. So to give you a bit of background, liberalism began, at least by the early 1300s, with people like William Ockham. And then you had the Renaissance in the 1400s, followed by the Protestant Revolution in the 1500s, followed by the Enlightenment in the 16 and 1700s, and then you've got the American French revolutions and all the revolutions in the 1800s, particularly 1848, and that's about when Marx was writing. So you've got the rise of socialism and communism, and all these are different flavors of liberalism. And then in the 20th century, liberalism seemed to carry all before it. Now in 2025, liberalism seems to have become the default assumption, both inside and outside the church. So the popes were very aware of this trend historically. So there are many encyclicals written about liberalism. The earliest I know of is the early 1700s with Pope Leo XII, I believe. And the thing is, as they get later and later, the popes were very aware that their efforts to quell this movement hadn't been successful. So liberalism continued to advance no matter what the popes tried to do. And of course, things are radically worse than, say, Pope Leo XIII when he was writing. So liberals are very good at getting and holding power. And I'm going to, in this video, I'm going to focus on how they do that and then how that applies to the papacy. So firstly, one technique is an imprecise use of language. So liberals will speak unclearly, imprecisely, abstractly, even in full contradiction. So liberals gave up on truth a long time ago. So the Enlightenment officially ended, I suppose, with the death of Kant in 1804. And since that time, it's really just been about getting and holding power and how to increase their power, as opposed to like the triumph of reason or something as we imagine it. So there's a certain irony, I think, in Joe Heshmeyer's video, because he was using liberalism, the term itself, in a very imprecise way. So he seemed to use it kind of colloquially or politically, as opposed to how the Catholic Church would define it officially, which I thought was interesting in this sort of a video. And I assume no malice on his part, of course. But that's actually critical, that we define our terms properly, and that's something you always need to be thinking through when you're engaging with a potential liberal, is that they might be using words in the opposite way that you would be, say, love, justice, equity, dignity, whatever that is. They mean something very different than you probably do. So when Mr. Heshmeyer was talking about kind of liberals or conservatives, left and right and so on, those actually are very unhelpful because all those groups are liberal. So that's not actually a good distinction. When we're asking the question, is the Pope a liberal? We're asking, is he exalting human freedom, dignity, and so on above God, like reversing the order, which is essential, obviously, but it's very different than will Pope Leo vote Democrat or Republican. I'm not particularly interested in that question. So the next power trick or power tool that liberals use is hijacking Christian virtues. And this is particularly relevant in the church because this is kind of the church's function in the liberal order. So whenever liberals have a policy goal, the job of the church, the liberal church, is to support that goal by talking about love, by appeals to humanity and our good nature and so on, our care for the planet and whatever the issue is. So they can spin the most egregious thing as a Christian act just by hijacking Christian charity, basically. So there's the clip that Mr. Heshmeyer played where the cardinal asks, is the gospel liberal? And so the answer is, of course, the gospel isn't liberal, but is often hijacked to be used for liberal purposes, which is the material point. And that's something we always need to keep in mind when we're thinking about these issues. And really the third point I want to focus on is outcomes. We need to be focused on actual actions because with these 3 points, so vague use of language, hijacking Christian virtues, arrive at the third point, which is liberal actions. So we need to see the drift of the policies and actions over time. Are we consistently seeing leftward drift, basically? Are traditionalists being shut down? Are clear leftists, liberals being promoted, and so on? So we're always going to be looking for patterns of action as opposed to saying, this document contains some nice words. Now, we want nice words, of course, but ultimately we're looking for patterns of action over time. Now let's talk about how to evaluate a new pope. Not Pope Leo specifically, just any pope. Now, first of all, we want to give him the benefit of the doubt, and also we want to give him time. So there is going to be a certain period of time when he needs to get his bearings and we need to give him space. Not that our individual opinions even really matter, but just collectively, there needs to be grace for a certain period of time. But that time will pass, and eventually it will become clear by his statements, writings, interviews, actions, and so on, kind of what he's about. And so we can evaluate him with these 3 criteria that I just mentioned. So first of all, the use of language. When he writes something or when he speaks, is it really clear what he actually intends with these words? Because a mature liberal, or a sophisticated liberal, which someone who's risen to the level of a pope will be sophisticated, can speak outside both sides of their mouth using the same words. So a statement about, say, the poor can be taken in a traditional Catholic way or a communist way without changing any of the words. And whenever you see this occurrence, that's a timeout, stop, this is a fail, because this is precisely a liberal technique that isn't acceptable. And the reason I called this video The Limits of Steel Manning is because whenever there's a liberal pope, the possibility of steel manning will always be there in the language. That's a tool of power. And so steel manning is not an appropriate technique to evaluate liberals, basically. It's just out of bounds because they will always allow for that, but in practice they will intend the opposite of the steelman version. Now, if you're debating someone, and specifically if someone is right in front of you and you can engage with them, of course you need to be steel manning, that's a good principle, but it's completely unacceptable for evaluating liberals from a distance. So conversely, is the Pope speaking very precisely? Is it clear what he intends? Is he using Catholic applications as well. So let's say he's talking about the poor. There's the theory aspect, which we want, but there's also the application, what policies need to be enacted. So it's clear. Catholics have clear positions. There's a clear understanding of economic principles to apply here. And if it's left unstated, again, that is a problem. Now, what about Christian charity? Now, of course, the Pope needs to lean heavily into the virtues, needs to preach about them, needs to support them. But of course, when we're evaluating a Pope, how is that being done? Is it done in a way that's kind of potentially hijacking those virtues? So, migration's a big one right now. Climate's a big one right now. You can, of course, speak to those and should speak to those in a Christian way. But first of all, there's thousands of issues, hundreds of issues, whatever the number is, that could potentially be spoken on. So is the Pope seemingly always aligning with the UN or EU or whoever? Or is he speaking about other things? Or when he does speak to those issues, is he going against them clearly? Again, this is a black and white distinction. The Catholic Church is in strong opposition to the world at this point. There's going to be a harsh opposition because of the drastic differences in the worldview. So are you feeling alignment in these statements? So is the Pope, when he's speaking about the poor, is he aligning with the UN or is he opposing the UN? Is it clear that there's a difference? And of course, the UN or EU, whoever, can get things right. And so there doesn't always need to be opposition. But it will be obvious over time whether the Pope is aligning with the liberal global order or if he's opposing it. And of course, being a Catholic, he should be opposing it clearly. This should not be confusing or tricky. And then lastly, of course, we have the actions. Conservatives have a statement that Cthulhu swims slowly, but he always swims to the left. And I don't need to get into who Cthulhu is, but the point is, the liberal society political order will always drift left, even if it goes slowly. So if the new Pope is a liberal Pope, we're going to be expecting slow leftward action. So we're going to see traditional masses slowly shut down. We're going to see liberal bishops and cardinals slowly appointed. We're not going to see any opposition to the left, however. So like pedophiles, homosexuals, things like that will not be suppressed to the same level. And of course, there will be nods to traditionalists, but those aren't particularly interesting because all liberals do that, because especially when there's a mixture of constituents, they need to be able to appeal to both. So they're not going to just go full liberal. We wouldn't expect that. We would see just a slow leftward drift with the pontificate. Okay, so now we come to Pope Leo specifically. By this point, he's said and written enough. We've heard the interviews and we've seen some actions. So I think we are at the point where we can begin to evaluate him. I've given you the criteria, so I don't necessarily even want to give him a full evaluation. You can do that for yourself. But I do want to speak about the migrant crisis, because I think that is the policy issue of our day. And it's fairly severe, and also Pope Leo has spoken on this extensively. So if you're not aware, in Europe, liberal governments are essentially using migrants from Africa and the Middle East as kind of a weapon against the native populations. So migrants are being brought in by the millions, and unfortunately, many of those migrants are violent, come from societies, cultures where like rape of children is okay, slavery is okay, and they are doing these things against the native populations of the countries they're being brought into by literal hundreds of thousands. It's a terrible crisis. It's essentially a slow ethnic cleansing. So the native populations are encouraged not to have children, and then migrants are being imported to rape them and then have large families. And so I don't see how Europe exists in 30 years. I see an extension of Africa and the Middle East north. So when you think about how historic popes acted against these sorts of invasions, Urban II, you know, obviously called the Crusade, or other popes called Crusades, and things like that. So the Catholic response is fairly clear in the face of invasion and rape, basically. So now, what is Pope Leo said? You know, he's emphasized the dignity of the migrants, how they're messengers of hope, railed against the inhumane treatment of them, and so on. And so you look at these statements and ask yourself, okay, is he telling us to treat the migrant as if Christ, you know, as if they were Christ, you know, appealing to Christian charity in a valid way? Or is he promoting the destruction of the West? Now, assuming Pope Leo actually is aware of the crisis, and he is, I don't know how to interpret his statements other than he's promoting the destruction of the West. So liberals are going to want to destroy the West, and traditionalists obviously want to support Christendom, or even the vestiges of Christendom, as best they can. So Pope Leo seems to be acting as an extreme liberal on the issue of migration. And of course, you've seen what he's done on climate change and things like that. And I read a letter of his about migration where he threw in climate change and migration and the poor all at once to support the liberal global agenda. So we can talk about actions. There's been multiple dioceses during his pontificate where their traditional masses have been shut down. We've seen liberal bishops advanced to positions of power. You know, Pope Leo is no more, no less than we would expect a pope to be in 2025. And kind of, unless we have a miraculous view of the papacy, meaning God's just always going to intervene miraculously and give us a faithful pope, we would expect, given the state of the world right now, that the Pope would be liberal, and Pope Leo certainly does seem to be liberal. So in conclusion, I've seen a tendency with more traditional Catholics on the right, or conservative leaning, to steelman, to give the benefit of the doubt, to take whatever the Pope does in the best possible light. And I definitely think that's a good kind of tendency. But we always need to have our eyes wide open, just be real. So let's say your father's an alcoholic. It wouldn't actually be healthy or helpful to say that, you know, my dad's just really thirsty and he likes the taste of liquor. It's like, no, you need to be able to admit to yourself that your father is an alcoholic. And of course, you need to give him love, honor, and prayer as he deserves as your father. But just be real. Your father's an alcoholic. And in this case, in 2025, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church is not healthy right now. And let's just be real about that. We don't need to slam them or tell everyone we know that there's problems, but we at least need to be honest with ourselves and be able to see clearly, to evaluate accurately, and to pray and to live as best we can. You know, my opinion of the Pope doesn't matter. I'm not his judge, but I do want to understand the world, just for the salvation of myself and my family, and, you know, the people with me in the parish. We need to understand how the world really is. I think that's important, which is why I made this video ultimately. So I do hope this was helpful, and God bless.